Shall we start now?
Sure.
Yeah. You start, Dr. Trupti.
Sir,
Ramesh sir.
Yeah, start. Trupti,
Yeah.
start.
Dr. Ramesh sir will start, sir.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, good evening, respected seniors, dear friends. I welcome you all to this webinar. It seems amazing to think that barely 6 months ago, none of us had heard of coronavirus or the term COVID-19. Life has changed beyond all recognition, both personally and professionally. The year 2020 began with a not so great scenario that escalated rapidly into pandemic that has crippled the functioning of humankind. A lot has happened over this period of last 4 to 6 months. So many people have lost their life to this microscopic virus. These two words, coronavirus and COVID-19, are familiar to now every person in the world since it has made a huge impact on everything that rules people's lives, business, economy, and simply put their way of living. Simply to put, COVID-19 is disease and SARS-CoV-2 is virus. Why this webinar? There is so much of information we get every day on social media, WhatsApp groups, everywhere. But interestingly, 81% of the information which is available on net has no authentic source. So we thought to sort it out. Now, who is the better person than Dr. Nitin Shah? Everyone knows Dr. Nitin Shah. Still introducing him. He's a section head, pediatric department, PD Hinduja Hospital. He's honorary consultant, pediatric hemato-oncology, BJ Wadi Hospital. He was past president, Central IIP 2006. But apart from his all tremendous academic credentials, he is known as his warm, always jovial nature. Every pediatrician across the country considers him a friend. Whenever anybody contacts him, even on WhatsApp, immediately he is ready to help. And we are fortunate to have him in our WhatsApp group, Gujarat Pediatrician, which I started 5 years back with the intention of helping our colleagues practicing in day-to-day problems wherever one can help, because that was the aim, that help should be rendered by all and help should be sought by all. And we are fortunate that Dr. Nitin Bhai was there since beginning of this group. I dedicate today's webinar to vibrant members of Gujarat Pediatrician Group. On this opportunity, I would like to thank Sanofi Pasteur for providing us platform, especially Badri Narayan Patnaik sir, his head medical vaccines, South Asia and India. Dr. Trupti Bachi, she's disease expert in vaccine. Now, Nitin bhai, humankind was enjoying in mall, in movies, multiplex, everywhere, and suddenly this tiny virus came. And there is a tug of war. Everybody has his own opinion from where this virus came. So virus was already existing, or it's a new virus. Can you throw light from where actually this virus came?
So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ramesh Bajania for having this idea of doing a webinar, which is just one-to-one dialogue. And I mean, I had to really slog through to read so much and compile into a capsule. But it's a good idea just to discuss, because when you give didactic lectures, it becomes sometimes boring. So I'll try to be precise and as simple as possible. But first is my disclaimer that I'm not a COVID expert. What I have done is available data, which is from authentic source. I have tried to put in a capsule and give what is my view of that data. And this is such a rapidly evolving disease, and the data emerging is so fast every day that what I said today may become irrelevant tomorrow, or may become relevant again day after tomorrow. So with that pinch of salt, I would always first say that you must always read the local and the national guidelines, because we are all supposed to follow the national guideline and the local guideline. And sometimes it is so funny that the guideline in Mumbai may be different from Delhi and vice versa. So always follow your local guidelines as far as the basics are concerned. Yes, to understand the disease, the nitty-gritty of the treatment, why the treatment, etc. Surely there is a lot of knowledge, and which I will try to help you. So coming to that, the world was busy celebrating the new year coming on 1st of January 2020. On 30th December, China CDC reported to WHO that they are seeing cases of pneumonia which are dying fast in young people and also in people who are not healthy, who have risk factor, and they are not able to find out what the new disease is, but some new agent. So they reported to WHO, and then within no time they found out it is a new coronavirus. We had the previous coronaviruses, SARS and the MERS, and we also know that coronaviruses exist which lead to common cold and the upper respiratory infection. So coronaviruses are not new, but coronaviruses are generally animal source. So when you have a new disease in humans, which goes out of hand leading to pandemic like this, it had to be not a human virus. It had to be a new virus to which mankind will take some time to wake up and to mount a response. And by then they control the virus by having a lot of herd effect. The virus will take a toll on the community and on the people. Looking at the DNA, the genetic sequencing of the virus as it is put by the Chinese scientists, it has almost 92% similarity to the bat's coronavirus. That's why the most probabilities is the bat virus which has entered humans. And where did it happen? In Hubei town in China, where live animal markets are just next to human beings. There are a lot of reassortment between human and animal viruses in general, including influenza and including corona. And lo and behold, we had this coronavirus which mutated and found a way in a human and then spread like a wildfire because human being didn't have any immunity or know how to tackle it. And then looking at the local, I mean, the way people are traveling in the world before this COVID-19, it was a matter of time before it would spread to every corner. And you can see very clearly that as Italy had a leather trade connection with the Hubei town, a lot of Chinese used to go to Italy and vice versa. And the first worst affected country was Italy. So everything is in a jigsaw puzzle which is fitting to say that an animal, probably a bat virus, came to humans in China. From there, it spread to the other countries. And before countries could lock down their boundaries, it had become an endemic disease in most of the part of the world, with almost 17 million cases and 7 lakh people having died of this disease.
Okay, fair enough. Nitin bhai, as a pediatrician, when all our colleagues, paramedics, when they were all worried doing office practice, as a pediatrician, we were a bit complacent because the COVID-19 was not that common in children. So why children are not so affected?
So it is still not very common in children. If you look at any large database, then less than 2% of the COVID cases are in children less than 18 years old, which means it's almost rare. And even in those where it happens in less than 2%, those children are usually asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic, very rarely needing admission. In fact, I mean, recently a paper has been published from Pune group, Dr. Lalwani's group, first 50 cases of COVID in their area, and they have found that most of the children were mild or asymptomatic, and those who were positive and symptomatic, some of them, a lot of them had comorbidity. Same is the experience at Wadia Children Hospital, where of course I'm not going since last few months because of COVID, but my colleagues there who are treating, they've had 120 admissions, and almost 60-70% of them had some comorbidities like diabetes, ketoacidosis, nephrotic syndrome on steroids, malignancy patient like our patient, etc. So, and the death is almost unknown in those who are otherwise healthy children, even when they are admitted for some severe illness. Why children are less affected? Many reasons. Number one, we children are constantly affected by many viral infections, so there is a lot of immune stimulation happening. Number two, they take a lot of vaccines which also keeps on stimulating the immune system every now and then. So when you have stimulation, you have stimulation of both the innate immunity and the specific immunity, which is B cell or T cell. So when the innate immunity is on a constant antenna up situation, it will also fight any other new virus very big way. So that's how easy conjuncture put that why children are less affected is because they are always on a immune stimulation course. Now, why they don't develop severe COVID is because if you know in adults, as we will discuss, children, people who become severely affected and enter into hospitalization with pneumonia and other things, they go into what we call cytokine storm, which is an immunological reaction. So obviously children, because the immune system is not as robust as it is developing, they don't mount an abnormal cytokine response. That's the reason why they don't become very serious. Of course, dispelling this myth is the phenomenon of PIMS, what we know is a multi-inflammatory system disease, which is specific to pediatric population, which is an immune response. So we will discuss that as the time goes. But generally, these are the belief. The number one, children are usually not going out too much. They don't have too much of comorbidities. The immune system is evolving and is under constant stimulation by various viral infection and vaccines is making children. The fact is that the children are less affected.
Right. So they say that children are not much affected, but when they are affected differently.
Correct.
So as you said, what is PIMS, PS or MIS-C?
Yeah.
When do you suspect it? I mean, as a pediatrician, I am worried that whatever child I am seeing, whether it is a case of PIMS, TS or not.
So two implications. First of all, after a COVID disease is setting in adults in an area, after 2 or 3 months, pediatrician will start seeing what is PIMS. What is PIMS? Pediatric inflammatory multisystem disorder, which is temporally related to SARS-CoV-2 virus or the COVID-19 virus. Now the term is known as multisystemic inflammatory disorder specific to children. Whatever name you give, essentially it is an immunological reaction to past COVID infection that happened in a child with or without the knowledge of the child and the family. So many times there may be history of some fever, cough, cold 3-4 weeks back, and the child comes now in a very severe high fever, etc. What like looks like PIMS. Or sometimes there may be no history and patient directly comes with PIMS. So anyone coming in the first 18 years of life, and there are 5 or 6 symptoms or signs that you should look for: high fever, GI symptom, diarrhea and vomiting, but dehydration out of proportion to the diarrhea. CNS, encephalopathy, irritation, confusion, okay, and your multi-organ involvement. So there is a liver involvement, lung involvement, rapidly child becoming sick, and younger children below 5-6 years come like Kawasaki disease. So they have conjunctivitis, which is apurulent, they have chapped skin in the lips, they have conjunctival congestion along with redness of the tongue, they may have a cervical lymph node, and they have rash, which is typical all over the body. Older children come more like toxic shock syndrome. So they have fever, cough, diarrhea, and suddenly they come with hypotension, going into shock, and they need to be resuscitated. They go on ionotropes and so on and so forth. Once you suspect and admit such children, then you investigate, you know, there is multi-organ involvement. So there may be high D-dimer, subclinical DIC, liver enzyme which are raised, lung which may be involved, typically bilateral basal consolidation, etc. And a patient is going on inotrope with a very high CRP, but not high procalcitonin. So these are all this very similar markers that you see in adult who is admitted in ICU. The difference is that the outcome is very good. I mean, mortality is usually less than 2 to 3% if you suspect it in time and treat them in time. And there are various protocols available to treat them and to find out when to suspect. They are available. If anyone is interested, can contact me. I will send them those articles. But USA, UK was the first to, UK pediatric was the first to detect PIMS in a cluster of 8 or 9 patients reported to WHO. After that, in New York city hospitals, there were more than 100 cases. Then the entire US CDC did a networking, and an article is published in NEJM recently, back to back, with 167 cases. And all of them have a very similar thing. Older child comes with toxic shock syndrome like picture, younger child comes like Kawasaki disease.
So this is caused by COVID-19?
It is caused by COVID-19, but it is not caused by the COVID-19 virus per se. It's an immunological reaction by the body to the past infection of COVID-19. Now, why do I say so? When you have a child who comes collapsed like this, and you do his COVID PCR, nasopharyngeal swab, in less than 20%, it will be positive, or say up to 1/3 at the most. Remaining 2/3, it is negative. If you do an antibody, then it will be positive. Now, mind you, antibody test is available only of late in our country and in many parts of the world. So in past, antibodies were not available. It was very difficult to say what is the cause of this. Once the antibodies started coming positive, then you knew that these are all immunological reaction to past COVID infection. And almost 20%, even the antibody may be negative, but you treat them as PIMS, and you repeat antibody after 1 or 2 weeks, then it will become positive, because it takes 3 to 4 weeks for the antibodies to become positive after you have a COVID infection. So you may have to do multiple of these tests to pick up one of them being positive, to tell you that it is temporally associated, time-wise associated with a COVID virus.
So this is how we prove.
Yes. So
Okay.
the
Then,
protocol now is you do an nasopharyngeal swab, knowing when it will come negative. You do an antibody test on the day one, and of course I prefer the chemiluminescence and not the ELISA or the lateral ELISA. Lateral ELISA is the least sensitive. We'll discuss that later. And if it's negative, you repeat one before the patient goes home.
right. Then once we know that this could be PIMS, then how do we manage?
Correct. So PIMS is an emergency in the sense that if you don't act in time or don't detect, and then you may lose the patient. So basically what is happening is that they have very high CRP. They have a Kawasaki-like picture with myocarditis or coronary dilatation. Older children, myocarditis more. Younger children, Kawasaki-like disease more with coronary dilatation. They have other organ involved, including lung and liver, but of course that's not what going to kill them. They come with neutrophilia and lymphopenia. Unlike Kawasaki, they have thrombocytopenia, and they come with shock, with peripheral shock and bone ionotropes. So these children should be treated. I mean, there are again scoring system for mild PIMS, moderate PIMS, and severe PIMS. And again, I'll send you if someone wants it. Generally, mild PIMS are the ones where the organs are not having great dysfunction. Moderate will be where organ are dysfunction, but their needs for inotropies by scoring less than 10 on a score, and severe will be when the score is more than 10. So the milder variety, you treat them with 1 to 2 mg per kg of methylprednisolone, moderate one with 5 to 10 mg per kg of methylprednisolone, and severe you pulse with 20 to 30 mg per kg of methylprednisolone for 3 to 5 days. Once they start improving, you taper the steroid slowly over 2 to 3 weeks in moderate and over 4 to 6 weeks in severe. In smaller children, IVIG, nowadays they believe giving IVIG in everyone, but in a very older child, 30, 40 kilo, it may be very difficult to, because cost may be an issue many times. So IVIG is again required for everyone. And if they don't respond to all of this, and if they have myocarditis, you may even add tocilizumab as you add in a older patient. So these are the three main armamentarium. Remember to investigate for other causes. Let's not miss a burst appendix, a sepsis, or a influenza in our zeal of diagnosing everyone coming like this as PIMS. So you have to do other investigation, including a multiplex PCR, like biofires of the respiratory system or of the GI system, and always start an antibiotic after taking culture till you prove it's PIMS by having an antibody positive and the patient responding to your PIMS treatment.
So, according to literature, till now, how many children might have been affected?
More than 1,000 to 2,000 cases are already on record. But remember, I mean, you must all read that editorial in the NEGM where there are 2 articles published from the US group. The editor very clearly said that it's like we seeing an elephant like a parable, where everyone looks at the elephant the way he wants. Now with PIMS being diagnosed, now certain it's because of SARS, etc. We still don't know whether it is the complete picture or no, because there may be lots of mild cases which went unnoticed, because not everyone will become severe enough to need hospitalization. I was in one of the seminars where one of the dermatologists from Aurangabad was there, and he said that they see a lot of urticaria in children. Maybe that urticaria is a milder PIMS. So what I'm trying to say is you look out for the signs now, because see, we saw our first PIMS say around 3 weeks back. We saw one more yesterday. We have seen some more than 25 in Vadia. The Kanchikata Combat group has seen already 25, Dr. Bala's group. Delhi Max has seen, Chitkara doctor, all of them. So everyone is trying to seeing PIMS again. Either is because now is increasing, as I said, it takes few months after the COVID sets in your area. And second, because you see one, then you don't miss the next, third, second, the next time.
Right, because looking to India's population, even a small percentage could be large numbers. So we as a pediatrician have to be vigilant.
Yeah. But the silver line is that the mortality is very rare, it's less than 2%, if you treat them well in time.
Right. Nitin bhai, everybody is afraid of COVID because, as we know, it behaves very strangely. And our relatives, our known, they get admitted in hospital. Suddenly they deteriorate. Sometimes older patients with all comorbidities, they come out. Suddenly young people with no morbidity, with complete fitness, they deteriorate over the hours. So why this strange behavior? Is there any particular about pathophysiology of this COVID?
So the pathophysiology of the COVID in children we know is PIMS, which is immunological reaction, or very mild COVID in most of them, unless they are having immune compromising condition, which I said, like malignancy, diabetes, steroids, etc., where they may develop pneumonia and things like that, but still most of them come out.
So in adults it is different.
Adults is almost similar in the sense, but the difference is only one, then either you don't detect that you have pulmonary involvement in time because you did not do your 6 minutes walk test or you did not check your pulse oximetry. There's something known as happy hypoxia, where people don't feel breathless and still they are hypoxic. Now, if they don't take treatment in time, they can deteriorate very fast. And sometimes, from the time that you have first dip in your saturation to your time in going into ICU, maybe 24 hours. And if you miss that golden chance because you did not detect yourself or because you are struggling to get a bed in an ICU, you can be in trouble. Now, with the understanding and everyone knowing how to monitor a COVID positive adult, I am sure that incidence is going down. And also because of the increase in the infrastructure, beds being easily available, fear is less, and actually getting bed is not that great a problem in most of the cities, including in Mumbai and in Delhi. But I'm sure every new area, initially there's a lot of tough time to get the beds. So the pathophysiology wise, the virus itself generally doesn't kill. If the virus is detected up to 8 or 10 days, after that, if you do PCR, you may be positive, but the CDC very clearly says that after 10 days, you are not infective. So maybe that's the dead virus. Whereas people deteriorate usually in the second and the third week of the COVID. So it is clearly is not a virus which is killing you directly. It's a virus which is setting in an immunological response in the form of a release of cytokine, which is leading to the disease. So we know in past we had cytokine storm in children with hemophagocytic syndrome, HLH. We knew the H5N1 bird flu, which fortunately restricted to only 50, 60 cases in world and died off because it was a very lethal disease with 60% mortality. All those who died of bird flu that time had HLH. So we know that these viruses, when they go out of hand, they lead to a lot of cytokine storm release, and that leads to organ damage now. So we have liver damage, lung damage, everything is because of the cytokine storm. So there are two or three things that happen. One, adults go into ARDS like picture. They also have microthrombi in the lung. They may get secondly infected, and they have a lot of fibrosis which is setting in acutely and on the follow-up. Besides that, a secondary infection is very common in adults with comorbidities, and they generally may have other organ dysfunction like renal failure, etc., which and diabetes especially, which puts them into trouble with any, even generally with any infection. All this combined is leading to this problem in adults getting into trouble. But generally, I believe those who are young and are turned very serious, of course, they might have developed myocarditis, which is an acute phenomenon, or an acute myocardial infarct as a cause of thromboembolism, or an acute stroke. These are the three acute illnesses which can kill any age group. But beyond that, it may be because they are young and they have taken it lightly and they have been happy hypoxia without their realization. So my plea is that if you are COVID suspect or you are COVID proven, you must check your saturation 4 times in a day, out of which 2 times at least should be 6 minutes walk test. If your saturations are 95 and above, even after 6 minutes walk on a daily basis, these are very unlikely that you will land into ICU the next day.
Right. So, what should be the management approach in general for COVID
So,
patients?
so once you're COVID positive, either because you have symptoms, so you have tested yourself, or you are in contact with someone, that's why you are tested even when you are asymptomatic. So, if you are asymptomatic, of course, you keep quarantine. Now, different areas have different quarantine timing. Some areas it is 17 days, some areas it is 14 days. CDC says 10 days is enough. In our hospital on 11 day, if they find they are allowed to join a special healthcare worker and so on and so forth. So follow a local guideline. But for those that days, whatever 10 to 17 days of quarantine, watch for symptom, fever, breathlessness, chest pain, diarrhea, and your saturation, even when you are not having any of this, with 6 minutes walk test. If all these five and your heart rate are under control, and if you have passed 2 weeks, very unlikely you will need hospitalization. Anytime your saturations fall below 94, either at rest or on 6 minutes walk test, or if you develop symptoms like chest pain, uneasiness, dehydration, etc., then you should be hospitalized. Or if you are above 60 and with comorbidity, even when you are not that sick, in many areas, including Mumbai, the local authorities prefer that they are under medical care so that if any of the symptoms develop, they can be helped. So they may not be in hospital, but they may be taken to a COVID center where a doctor will examine the person every day. So depending upon the locality, you have different guidelines. But the bottom line, people above 60, people with comorbidity, and people whose saturation are low must be get medical attention. And last thing, we should not treat ourselves on our own. I may be an expert on COVID talking today. If I do a fever and COVID positive, I will shut my brain and I'll go to the physician and take his help. Because either I may under treat myself or I may over treat myself. And that should not happen.
Right. Nitin, but there is something called inoculum effect.
Yes.
So many have heard this for the first time related to COVID. Can you
That's
elaborate
right.
what it is?
So inoculum effect was something which was thought of because some people felt that when healthcare workers get COVID, many of them are very severely affected. So it was always believed that maybe because healthcare workers are exposed to a lot of inoculum as compared to your social contact, getting COVID from a social contact where you may not have got so much of inoculum. So suppose you have a COVID positive child or adult coughing on you, you are not wearing mask, he is not wearing mask, a lot of virus is going to enter your body. So there was a paper which is published in the Journal of International Journal of Infectious Disease by Dr. Gular's group, where what they looked at three different cohorts or clusters of COVID in Madrid, Spain. One was a cluster where almost 25 people were living, but in a huge house of 20,000 square feet. So it was like a palace. And very few got infected, and most of them were not severe enough. Then there was a cluster of another 12 patients who were staying in a moderate large house, so 6,000 square feet as compared to 20,000. And a lot of them got infected, a lot of them got severe infection. And then there was a cluster of people attending a conference in a very small conference hall, which was just 600 square feet, 10 of them sitting for 3 hours. Everyone got infected and everyone got severe infection with hospitalization. So this cluster study then showed that it is the inoculum. The larger the house, lesser was the inoculum, smaller the hall, more was the inoculum, and that led to incidence as well as severity going up with larger inoculum size. So if you are wearing even a cloth mask, and your patient is wearing a cloth mask, your inoculum will be much lesser as compared to both of you not wearing any mask. If you are wearing N95 mask and your patient is wearing a 3-ply mask, is virtually blocking any transmission. By and large, your inoculum will be very, very low. That's how many of us who are practicing for months now. Not one day I miss going to Hinduja hospital. Not one day I have kept my clinic closed. With God's wish, I am not going to infected. I take a lot of precaution in doffing, donning, and the type of PP that I use in the different areas.
Okay. Now, Nitin, I think we should take a few questions.
Sure.
And I request all the friends to send their questions and answer column and not in chat. Dr. Devan Pandya wants to know that can plasma therapy lead to cytokine storm as PIMS is antigen antibody complex mediated therapy? I think we'll take it later. Dr. Dhiren Gupta wants to know that why in adult lung is predominantly involved as immune reaction.
Gupta should answer himself the answer, don't ask me.
Secondary to COVID-19 due to CKS, but why in pediatric it is hypotension and IVG is used at first?
I think in adults there is more thromboembolism than in children. That's what my gut feeling is. That's why you don't see too much of thromboembolism in children as compared to adults. When they get thromboembolism and they have borderline lung and heart involvement, obviously the lung and heart both take a very direct hit. So it's not only the lung which leads to thromboembolism, lung which gets affected in adults, they also have a lot of myocarditis. And some of them can develop acute myocardial infarct-like picture. So lung and heart are the essential organs which are involved in adults, maybe because of the subtle thromboembolism. And lung is, of course, because it's the direct entry source of the virus. So first thing it leads to is pneumonia. But many times the pneumonia also leads to secondary, because the microthrombi, there's a lot of pressure change, it leads to a lot of strain on the heart, and the heart takes the next hit.
Okay. Now, evergreen, our Devan, like Dr. Uday Bodhankar sir.
Are, namaskar sir.
He wants to know that is it true that asymptomatic positive patients are not infectious? And
no, that's
so they should not be quarantined as per new WHO guidelines. This is what he wants to know.
Yes, yesterday only we read the paper which says actually that the asymptomatic people transmit the disease just the same way as symptomatic patient. So an
Oh.
asymptomatic patient actually is more dangerous than a symptomatic patient, because the parent that accompany our child who is not going to be infected for vaccine, and if they are not wearing a mask, or their mask is hanging down the chin, or they are wearing a mask with a valve, is more dangerous than a person who is having fever and cough. I know that fellow has to keep a distance from me.
Hidden super spreaders like.
Yes.
Dr. Anil Chauhan from Verawar wants to know that should we get immunoglobulin G test for ourselves, because a lot of colleagues
That's a
they are
good
getting it.
question. So one thing, see, we'll come to serodiagnosis if we are discussing, but serodiagnosis is done by three ways: ELISA lateral assay, and an ELISA, which may be either a strip ELISA or an actual ELISA. The third is a chemiluminescence, ECLIA. Of the three, the best sensitivity of ECLIA, almost 95 to 98%. Next is ELISA, which is around 90 to 92%. Then the lateral flow, which is around 85%. Specificity of all the three is nearly 99%. Now, you develop antibody after 3 to 4 weeks. So it doesn't tell you when you have developed your COVID before. It was at least 3 weeks before, maybe up to 3 months, because the antibodies surely persist for 3 to 4 months. So if you do your antibody and you want to use it as a passport, that okay, you have done with it and you are end of it, as used to happen in Italy and other countries, where those which are antibody positive are sent as frontline warriors to work in the hospital. I think it's too much, because we don't know about the second infection. The COVID itself is just 6 months old. We don't know, after 8-9 months you may develop a second infection with COVID, and you may be even worse hit. So I would suggest that you may do an antibody just to understand your epidemiology. So hospital may do, to find out how many of the healthcare workers have got infected, to tell how good is the PPE use, and not whether you are protected or not protected. The community may do, to understand how much is the community spread. Like they did it in Delhi, they found 23%. They did in Bombay now, and they found 56% of the slum areas were positive, and around 16% in non-slum areas. So we know a lot of people in Bombay already infected. So from that point of view, yes, for individual use, it's a waste of money if you ask me.
Okay. Dr. Bhavesh Shah wants to know that what is the best window to ask for RT-PCR after fever?
So once you are symptomatic, you can do RT-PCR in 24 to 48 hours, as soon as possible, no problem. If you are symptomatic, which means the virus is already there, if that is the cause. In an asymptomatic contact, they say the best time to pick up is between 5th to 12th day, or if symptoms develop, then earlier.
Okay. Now, how Dr. Harilal Nayak wants to know that how to pick up myocarditis clinically and investigation-wise. I think that
Clinically, you will have tachycardia, which is out of proportion. Patient may have STD changes, and you do ProPI and the ProBN, and both of them will show you that high, very high, suggesting myocarditis. And of course, you will have cardiomegaly, and you may have ECG changes of myocarditis.
so. Moving ahead now, as a pediatrician and neonatologist, we are worried about perinatal and postnatal transmission.
Sure. So it was believed so far that the perinatal transmission probably doesn't happen, but that's not true. There's a very recent paper in Archives of Disease of Child and Fetal and Neonatal series, which actually looked at meta-analysis of 17 studies of PCR positive mothers. They tested the babies right on day 1 and day 2, and if anyone was found to be positive in the first 48 hours, was taken as evidence of perinatal transmission. So there were 402 mothers and 405 newborn, because some were twins, and they found that out of the 330 babies could be tested in the first 2 days of birth, and 9 out of the 330 were positive in the first 48 hours. So they calculated that the pooled incidence of such vertical transmission or perinatal transmission around 16 per 1,000 babies newborn. That's like 1.6%. And the range was 3.4 to 73 per 1,000. So 0.3 to 7.3%. So we know that yes, perinatal transmission is possible. Coming to the postnatal, there was an observation studies done in the New York City of USA, where they took mothers which were PCR positive, and they allowed them liberal contact with the child, skin to skin contact, breastfeeding allowed, rooming in the same area, but babies were kept in a isolate, giraffe type isolate, but the mother was touching the baby, wearing a mask and all. And this went on for 2 to 3 weeks. They tested the newborn on day 1, day 5 to 7 and day 14. So 3 times in the first 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the mother is not infective. And they found that of the 116 positive mother and 120 newborn pairs, none of the babies tested positive beyond 48 hours. First 48 hours were taken as perinatal, but the postnatal, none of them were positive, which means it showed that if the mother wears a mask and takes sanitization precaution, even if you have allowed skin to skin care and breastfeeding, there is absolutely no transmission. So the post-nasal transmission, I think we should really not worry. Don't separate the baby from the mother, keep in the same room, allow breastfeeding, do everything else, give the vaccine at the time of discharge, no worries at all. Only thing is hand sanitization and mask when the mother is going to touch the baby.
Right. Now, Dr. Ruchira Gupta wants to know that is there any role of aspirin in PIMS?
Yes, so there is role of aspirin pins for those who have thromboembolism, D-dimers are very high. You can initially give them, older child, I prefer to give them Clexane or enoxaparin, and a younger child, which are like Kawasaki, like with coronary dilation, put them on aspirin. Like Kawasaki, give aspirin full dose till fever goes. After make it 3 to 5 mg per kg, give it for 6 weeks, repeat an echo. If the echo is normal, you can stop it.
Right. Dr. Narayan Sankara from Rajkot wants to know that is there any relationship between COVID-19 and GBS, and what if both come simultaneously?
I haven't read any such data, but I'm sure there might be some small data if you Google about. It's not a major concern. I haven't read about that.
Okay. Now moving ahead, which are serodiagnostic?
So we welcome Dr. Badri, my friend. Hi, Badri. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm
So,
listening to
Badrinath Patak, sir.
yeah. What was the question, Dr. Ramesh? Sorry.
Yeah. About serodiagnosis.
Yeah.
Can you
So as I said, I large part of the serodiagnosis I discussed, saying that the serodiagnosis is mainly for community purpose or for hospital surveillance and not for individual diagnosis, because by the time this serology is positive is almost 3 weeks. All right. So it doesn't help you to diagnose during acute attack. And remember, your chances of being antibody positive in the first week is just 20%. In the second week is around 650 to 60%, and third week is around 82%. And beyond that, based on which test you use, if you use ELISA, it's around 82%. If you use the lateral assay, then it is 79 to 80% again. And if you use the chemiluminescence, then it's around 98%. So it's not for individual use, it's for the community use or for the surveillance for the community.
So, what does positive results mean, and what does negative results mean?
So negative means either you are not infected, that's most likely, or you are infected but you have not mounted an antibody response, which will typically happen in a person who is immune compromised. So like I've had the children who are thalassemics, and we do a COVID test before every admission in hospital. That's our hospital policy. So they undertake tests, and some of them are positive, and they were asymptomatic. But anyway, they were quarantined, and after 2-3 weeks, they were admitted for the transfusion. That time we did antibody, all of them were positive. Vis-a-vis, at a group of oncology patient under me who were same thing, they were due for chemo or they had febrile neutropenia. So we did the test, PCR was positive. They were quarantined at home or in the hospital wherever they needed treatment. And then next time when they came back at the antibody, most of them were antibody negative. It means they were false negative because of the immune response that they cannot mount because of immunodeficiency. But a healthy child, healthy person, 9 out of 10 times will mount a response. So if you are negative, it means you haven't had the infection in past. Or it's more than 4 months since your infection, because your antibody may disappear after 3 to 4 months in many healthy adults.
So, what is the objective of this serological survey? Why they do seroprevalence survey?
So now suppose in like in Bombay, did the sero surveillance in slum areas and non-slum area. We know in slum area 56% is sero positivity. Another 2 months it will become 70-80%. You would probably achieve herd immunity. The disease will become very low, and it's already so. Like in Dharavi, where I'm just staying, say 2 kilometers away from Dharavi. Dharavi had a huge outbreak, lot of cases every day with massive work done by municipality, excellent work done municipality and the team of doctors who are general practitioners in Dharavi, house to house survey for fever patient and testing them very vigorously, and complete lockdown. The disease disappeared most of them got infected. They were treated there locally, and now you can see we hardly see it. In fact, most of the centers had to be closed because there were no patients. So that is what can happen. So you know how much is your community already positivity. That will tell you when to unlock, when to start your malls, when to start your theater, when to allow the movie shooting to happen, when can you sort of go to restaurant with in-house dining, etc. When can your hotels open, etc. So all those will be based on your seroprevalence in your community.
And seroprevalence tells about all these things. But what does it, I mean, it can't tell which are the things which
It can't tell
seroprevalence
you
cannot.
that you are having acute infection. It can't tell you when you are infected if you are positive. It can't tell you whether you will be protected for your life because the disease is only 6 months old. My gut feeling is, based on the vaccine trials, that there is a lot of T cell response also mounted by vaccine virus. Obviously, it will be also done by the natural virus. And if you have a T cell immunity against virus, generally it is lifelong. That's my intelligent guess, but I will want to wait for the data to emerge, because there are anecdotal reports of a second infection happening within a month or two more severe than the first infection. So I am cautioning people that just because you are antibody positive doesn't give you a passport or license to move around without a mask. Mask, mask, and mask. Sanitization, sanitization, and sanitization. Distancing, distancing, and distancing are the only ways you can prevent yourself from getting infected, no matter where you are working. In most of the hospital, it is a non-COVID area where you have more healthcare worker getting infected than in the true COVID area, because in true COVID area, everyone is very, very agile, wearing hazmat suit, taking utmost precaution and not getting infected. In non-COVID area, people take their mouse, take tea, talk to each other, share tiffins. That is where they get infection from an unknown source. So mask, sanitization, and distancing are the three most important vaccines against COVID.
Absolutely. Nitin bhai, whenever we come to know about our known patient admitted for COVID-19, then most of the time they discuss about HRCT.
Correct.
So, as a common pediatrician, I would like to know how should I proceed as far as laboratory investigations are concerned when a patient on OPD basis or a patient is admitted.
Correct. So in children, usually they are asymptomatic, as I say, so you don't have to really investigate. I mean, I get a lot of what do you call, phone call or e-consultation for family infected, where there also child also is infected. They want to know what they should do about child. Most of the time, we have not done any investigation of those children, and they are all okay in 2-3 days time. And all we tell them is that now, after 4 weeks, if the child will have fever, beware that time, because he may go into PIMS rather than worrying about fever during acute problem, because that's going to be by and large recovering on its own. So, an adult, if you are symptomatic and if you don't have any comorbidity and you are below 50, I would say, then initially there is no need to do any test. You just observe yourself, same thing, 6 minutes walk test, saturation, look for the danger signs, and if any of them develop, then your doctor will decide what test to do. If you develop any of these signs like chest breathlessness, saturation going down, etc., certainly you should get hospital, and there they will do a CBC to look for neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. They will look for your organ specific function test, at least as baseline. They'll do a X-ray test and a ECG, etc. Of course, they'll do your inflammatory markers, which will be CRP, LDH, procalcitonin, and they may do an IL-6. They'll do a coagulation profile. They might do a baseline CT if you are breathless or if you're saturated low, to understand what is the baseline lung damage. And then they'll treat you with whatever treatment they want to give, and then they will, depending upon how you respond, they will follow up with this test being repeated depending upon how you behave. And generally, I don't think CT should be repeated. I mean, so many times someone is PCR positive on OPD basis, he's sent for CT scan straight away. You find some ground glass opacities on lungs which are 5% involved. How it is going to help you? You are not going to admit the person and not going to give him oxygen, not going to give him any treatment. He's going to be at home. So you reserve this type of CT scan, because one CT scan is equivalent to hundreds of X-rays worth radiation, and if we keep on repeating, it itself can lead to problem. So CT should be not done very liberally. It should be under the strict medical supervision.
Exactly, because now X-ray test has, I think, lost relevance in this COVID era,
Right.
which is more important. And
Absolutely.
CT scan has no specific science for
No,
COVID-19.
so CT scan can tell you how much of lung is involved. and that tells you how
It
bad
can
are you
occur
going to be. Yeah.
other viral pneumonia also, the
No,
similar
no, that is
pneumonia.
perfect. This is only if you're PCR positive. So your PCR
Right.
positive means your problem is because of COVID. Now, if you have done a CT which tells you your 50% lung, 60% lung is involved, you are going to be in trouble and you better get admitted somewhere. If you have 5%, 10%, you don't need. But that can also be decided by your saturations, especially with 6 minutes walk test and your other symptoms, rather than straight doing a CT scan.
So how about much hype Roth score?
About?
Roth score.
I think I'm not an adult specialist, so I don't really go into nitty-gritty of the scores.
It's a crude
But
estimation.
it's a very crude estimation. In fact, on CT you have, I mean, if you go online and you will have lots of scores which tells you that you take 5 lobes and you take how much percentage involved in each, and then you take addition, and then you can classify into mild, moderate, severe. But I think it is more clinical as much as the laboratory. Suppose you have a CRP of 140, and if you are clinically stable with 98% saturation, just you have fever, doesn't mean you're going to be given tocilizumab and steroid and every drug. So clinical judgment, I think, should not be superseded by any investigation.
Okay. And now even the common man knows a word comorbidity.
Correct.
Before this COVID pandemic, hardly people knew about it. Now even laymen know. So
Correct.
can you elaborate about risk factors,
Yeah,
comorbidity?
so there is a nice paper which has come in the JAMA, Journal of Medical American Medical Association, which has looked at almost 4,000 critical ICU admitted patients in Italy. It's a retrospective analysis, of course, and Italy had a maximum old population, and Italy had a maximum number of cases when the COVID started, and they found that the median age was 63. So I would say cutoff of 60. Below 60, you are safer than above 60 with or without comorbidity. Males, 80% of the admitted patients are males. So males are usually more severe than females. Then people with one or more comorbidities was 60% of this population which were in ICU. So obviously, if you don't have comorbidity, you are unlikely to get into at least ICU, though you may be admitted. So they found age. So they looked at various independent risk factors, and they found statistically significant risk factors among this patient, where the mortality was 48%. One was age, second was male sex, third is anyone needing FiO2, which is higher, needing higher PEEP to control the ARDS, anyone having a low PaO2 to FiO2 ratio. I think that is important. Your PaO2 in your blood gas versus your FiO2 which you require, if the ratio is below 300, that tells you are having severe ARDS, and then that's going to be really a problematic. COPD patient, patient with hypercholesterolemia, type 2 diabetes, and I would to that add 2 or 3 more risk factors. One is smoking, and second is obesity, hypertension, and a known cardiac illness. These are the other risk factors which can land into trouble. And more the number of these risk factors, more are your chances of getting severe disease and going into ICU.
Yes, one good thing which has happened, as you said about obesity, after PM Boris Johnson got admitted, he has now
Yes.
come out with a massive plan to control obesity, because he said that because I was obese, I suffered. And one more
He
thing,
has pledged millions
pledge.
of pounds for creating awareness about junk food and the types of food served in the schools and the drinks, cola drinks, etc., candies, and etc. I think that's a very great thing. So
So
I just
COVID-19
want
is
to,
bringing so many
yeah,
new things, and
I just
hopefully,
want to add one point here, that if you haven't lost weight in your lockdown time, then you be careful about your attitude toward life, because I'm sure all of us, I mean, we had stopped adding ghee on the chapati and thing like that, and still we were not losing weight. I'm sure because we were eating a lot of junk food outside every Sunday, catching a flight, traveling, eating the same junk food on the flight, going down to a hotel, eating the same sweets there, all those leading to putting on weight. Now after being COVID lockdown, we have started adding ghee to the chapati. We eat as much as we want, but we eat only home food, and most of us have lost weight.
absolutely, absolutely. Nitin, you said that males are more affected than females,
Yes,
by the way.
yes.
I mean, what is the reason?
I have no idea. Females are generally a stronger sex, maybe because they also have a better immune system than males,
Right.
and they have
Now,
less comorbidity, so they have less chance of ischemic heart disease. and thing like that.
Now, this COVID-18 is going to bring a very interesting future because so many patients will be there, so many survivors will be there, and so many patients with sequelae in form of pulmonary fibrosis. Some
Yeah.
people say that it is going to create a very serious problem for
Yeah.
national economy. It is going to, health budgets are going to go haywire out of
Yeah.
this thing.
So that is the scare that is there. I mean, again, Lancet has published on in May 15th a beautiful paper where they looked at pulmonary fibrosis in COVID patients, and they found that because of the acute lung injury, because of pneumonia, especially in severe cases, they had some of them had organizing pneumonia, which means they were fibrotic pneumonia, and they also had microthrombi, which was again leading to a lot of lung injury. All that led to a lot of chronic disease in this patient over the follow-up time. And many of them had pulmonary fibrosis, almost to suggest that you may actually treat them with the anti-fibrotic agents as you treat patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So they found that the incidence of pulmonary fibrosis in COVID patients who had ARDS, mind you, these are all ICU patients, not the ones which are in community or mild patients. It was 4% in the first week. It was almost 24% by the third week, and 60% in those who had ARDS above 3 weeks. So more you have ARDS, more are the chances that you have pulmonary fibrosis. And time only will prove whether this pulmonary fibrosis will resolve or it will become static or worse as the time goes. And again, two more papers recently, I mean, I just read them day before yesterday, talking about chronic cardiac damage. So they found that people who had severe COVID and myocarditis, some of them had MRI change. They had in fact studied 100 patients and they did follow-up MRI, and they found that almost 60 to 70% of these patients had changes on MRI persisting even after their discharge. So whether that would lead to further cardiac failure or a myocardial infarct-like picture later, or we don't know what will be the implication, but that's something that we'll have to look out for. And one paper looked at the autopsies done in patients who had died of COVID, and they found that a lot of them had myocardial damage. So lung and heart are not only hit during acute attack, but they are also likely to have chronic damage.
Right. Now, there are so many suggestions from, especially from alternate medicines that दिन में 3 बार castor oil आप nasal instillation करो, steam लो, gargles करो. Is there any scientific base behind all these measures?
So there have been actual papers published on some of this. So there was one paper from Seven Hills Hospital. Of course, that was not a blinded trial, so really you can't comment what was the really benefit or no. But they looked at steam inhalation, and they found that a lot of people improved with steam inhalation. Of course, they didn't have a control arm, so they can't say, they say almost 70% improved with steam inhalation. There is another paper from USA and UK which says that, not from USA but UK, from the Birmingham Hospital, Children's Hospital, that after COVID time, the steam inhalation has become such a rampant use, especially for Asians and other people, that the incidence of burns admission in children's ward has gone 30 times higher. So that's the flip side of the story, that you can get burns if you're not very careful. So doing steam is a harmless thing, provided you can do it without getting burns. I will not name, but a very famous pediatrician's daughter almost burned her face while taking steam for some mishap. So, you should be careful. I don't advise my patients steam inhalation for anything, but I'm sure there are people who vouch for it and they do stimulation. So that's for steam inhalation. The second is about nasal irrigation with saline, throat gargles, betadine gargles, etc. So there was a very nice paper which was published in the JAMA ENT journal, which looked at hypertonic saline instillation in the nose, and they found that it reduces mucostasis, it reduces local inflammation, it improves hydration, and that in turn improves mucociliary function. So that will help you clear out a lot of bacteria, viruses which are there in the mucociliary lining. Of course, when you put this saline, you can get a little burning and you may develop rhinorrhea or blocked nose, but that's a less side effect compared to the advantage they found. Of course, this was not in COVID time, this was in general about anyone having some influenza-like illness or any upper respiratory infection. And another group looked at 0.08% povidone iodine rinses and it found that it reduces viral titers. There are some who do povidone gargles, and they proved that you reduce your viral load in the oral cavity by almost 90%. Now, this is important for people like dentists who have to work for short time. This viral load goes down for short time, for an hour or two. But if you make a patient gargle just before you take him on the chair of dentist, then your dentist getting chance of getting infection because the aerosol generation will be grossly reduced. So yes, it is a rule. And I can tell you that I know of a hospital where they apply betadine to their nasal nares, that is nostrils, before they go to the COVID duty or go to the OPD, and they do betadine gargle, the healthcare worker, and they vouch that not a single healthcare worker has actually got infected. You develop some temporary loss of smell because of betadine application. That's for few hours, but that's a small price to pay. So yes, it may help. And there are, I mean, I'm sure all of you would have seen the famous video of the Jal Neti from Pune Hospital. I think it is Lata Mangeshkar Hospital, where the orthopedic surgeon, I think he's the head of the hospital, who teaches you to do how to do a Jal Neti, and he vouches that if those who have done Jal Neti, none of them have got infected. These are all small things which are anyway benign, maybe worth trying if you do it properly under guidance.
Now, for asymptomatic or a mild positive patients, they can be managed at home.
Absolutely.
So, what should be the home quarantine and management criteria?
So, home quarantine is generally for people who are less than 60 years, and if they don't have comorbidity. Above 60 with comorbidity, in Bombay, at least, if not in Mumbai per se, but in the suburbs and in the say New Bombay or Thane, they will insist that you be in a COVID center for better understanding and better what you call followed by a doctor who visits every day. So that's point number one. Number two, when you home quarantine, it's a strict quarantine where you just cannot move out of the house. Everything that you need is given at your doorstep. Number three, you watch for your symptoms. The same thing, you look for fever, look for cough, look for hydration, look for diarrhea, look for your saturation, look for your heart rate, and especially 6 minutes walk test. If none of them are going out of hand, and if you become asymptomatic after some time, then by 11 day in our hospital, 14 days in some places, 17 days in many places, you are then out of quarantine and you are allowed to mingle with people. And what treatment to give? Symptomatic treatment. People believe HCQ. I don't believe in HCQ. We can discuss at length about HCQ. There are lots of paper about HCQ. I don't believe in HCQ as a therapeutic response. People take zinc, vitamin C, which is fine if they want to take. They can take vitamin D, something if they've not taken because they are in home isolation or they are because lockdown in at home for last many months. They haven't had exposure to sun. Good to check your vitamin D and take vitamin D. These are all small, non-specific things for which there is really no science, but there is no harm in taking if someone wants to take it. But take it in moderation. Don't keep on taking vitamin D after vitamin D after vitamin D. Then you develop hypervitaminosis D. So that also should not happen.
Right.
So that's the treatment in the home quarantine.
So during this time,
and one thing, home quarantine is allowed also if you have a large house where you can be isolated in rooms preferably, and you have a separate toilet, even that is preferred. If you have a small house, single room, no separate private toilet, and if you're using a public toilet or a chawl light, no one will allow you home quarantine because you can infect others. Then you have to go to the COVID centers.
Right. So, which are the red flag signs? Like patient is settled. You said that they should monitor themselves.
Correct.
Now, which are the red flag signs which should warrant that now things are going out of hand?
Red flag sign is chest pain, breathlessness, saturation falling 94 or below, either at rest or on 6 minutes walk test, or any CNS symptom, confusion or disorientation, irritability, or not able to eat or drink well. These are the signs. Or you develop a stroke, obviously. These are the red flag signs for which you must look out for.
Right. Now, much talked about President Trump, in fact, started this HCQ. So, how come this HCQ come into vogue suddenly? Because it was used as a prophylaxis in malaria and rheumatoid arthritis. And how come it suddenly appeared on the scene?
So see, in the early phase, HCQ was used in China first. So HCQ is a big pendulum. It has gone yo-yo, useful, not useful, useful, not useful. But I'll tell you, it's not useful by and large. And why do I say so? So initially, in vitro studies were done not only COVID, but even during SARS and MERS time, that it reduces viral replication. So it was always a drug used as an immunomodulator for your patient with rheumatoid arthritis. It also is known to anti-thrombotic effect, which thromboembolism is a problem in COVID patients. So initial study was done in China based on this background. They gave in 100 patients, and they found that it was effective in reducing pneumonia, shortened the clinical course, improved lung images, and increased their viral negative seroconversion. Now, these are very early time. So they started giving HCQ to everyone. And after that, there was a study done in France. And that is a one group of study done. Dr. Gauret is there. His group strongly believes in HCQ in many diseases, including in COVID. And they found that 70% of those who were given HCQ, they again turned virologically cured, comparing with only 12.5% the control group. So they say, no, HCQ works. But these were all mild cases at home, and they were not talking about someone needing oxygenation, ventilation, ICU care, mortality, or early discharge, or chances of hospitalization. They were all talking about general decrease in the days to clinical shortening of the clinical course. But the real study which showed that there is some improvement in hospitalized patients, only one such study came from the Henry Ford Health System in Michigan in USA. There, it was a retrospective analysis where they had four group of people. Only HCQ group, one was HCQ with azithro group, one was only azithro group, and one was only standard of care where neither HCQ nor azithro was given. And they found that people, and they studied 2,500 plus consecutive hospitalized patients, and they found that overall mortality was just 18% in those who were hospitalized, which was much less than the historical mortality of 30-40%. And especially in HCQ, it was 13.5% as compared to none, where no other thing was given extra standard, where it was 26.4%. So this was statistically significant. But after that, you know what happened? Two big papers published in NEJM and Lancet, which had to be retracted because the authors had a very dubious way of studying and they were not ready to give, which actually had shown that HCQ doesn't work, but those were retracted. The real paper which showed that HCQ doesn't work came from recovery trial, which actually looked at 1,500 patients which were very sick in the UK, in the hospital, and they found that HCQ or no HCQ, there was no decrease in either mortality or any of the other clinical parameters. So, in fact, they stopped the HCQ from the trial. After that, we have one more trial from now Brazil, studying 660 plus patients given HCQ with azithro, without azithro versus standard care. Again, there was no decrease in either of the scores, whether increasing severity, ventilation, or death. And then a meta-analysis came which looked at four big trials and again found almost the same thing, that it doesn't work. Someone said also HCQ in early disease, which was tried in internet-based study in US and Canada, where people who were found to be positive, they were asked to take HCQ and say what happens to them. Again, they found that on a 10-score system, whether they took HCQ or they didn't HCQ, there was no decrease in need for either symptom like fever, cough, breathlessness, or need for hospitalization. They even tried it as a post-exposure prophylaxis. Moment you are in contact with someone and you take HCQ before you develop symptom, then again they found that it did not decrease your need for either of positivity or symptomatology or need for hospitalization. So for treatment, for mild, moderate cases, severe cases, or early cases, or as a post-exposure prophylaxis, HCQ was not found to be useful. Only one paper I have found from Kolkata, which has been recently published, which talks about pre-exposure prophylaxis. That is something which a lot of medicos are taking as per ICMR guideline. So what happened was there were occurring a lot of cases in medicos in that particular hospital in Kolkata. So they advised that everyone should take HCQ as per the ICMR guideline, which is 400 milligram BD on day one and then 400 milligram every week for 7 weeks. And if you want to continue 8 weeks beyond, you can continue, but you do an EKG to see that you don't have toxicity. And they found that around out of 106 healthcare workers, 54 took and the another 50 didn't take. So they had a group which had taken and group which had not taken. and they found that on each of these item, whether it is symptomatic contacts or whether face-to-face contacts or those which are wearing PPE or they were in direct contact, those who had taken HCQ almost had 90% less chance of getting infection than those who did not take HCQ. This is the only study which actually shows scientifically that pre-exposure prophylaxis works. We always had some benefits accruing, like in Mumbai, the police department HCQ was given as prophylaxis. There are some who took, some who didn't take, and those who had taken HCQ, none of them became severe enough or died, whereas those who had not taken, some of them had died. So these are, of course, not trial. The only trial which talks positive is this Kolkata trial. So based on this, I would say that HCQ as a treatment is almost a no-no. HCQ as a prophylaxis is an individual choice. That is pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Okay, fair. Now, coming to antiviral, what is the role of favipiravir?
Correct. So, there has been a trial. Favipiravir is a Japanese drug, and that has been not licensed even in Japan for COVID. That you should remember. It's actually a drug which is used for people who have influenza who are resistant to oseltamivir. So it's in that sense it's available since 2014. But because it was used against Ebola, against Lassa, someone thought that why not also use against COVID, because it does suppress the RNA polymerase, which is one of the ways which the COVID virus also replicates. So, two small trials on favipiravir in COVID are available. In one, 35 patients on favipiravir compared with 45 patients on lopinavir, ritonavir given for 14 days, and they found that there was faster viral clearance and higher improvement in imaging. But these are mild cases, not hospitalized. There was another trial which was little on larger number, 116 patients treated with favipiravir versus 120 who were given another drug which is known as umifenovir in moderate cases. So not in mild but moderate case, and they found that the clinical recovery was 71% in favipiravir group compared to 55% in the umifenovir group. So these are the only data available based on which the DCGI has approved favipiravir as a limited use in COVID mild to moderate cases, not for severe cases. But remember, it is a huge tablet load. You need to take 9 tablets twice a day on day 1 and then 4 tablets twice a day for another 12 to 13 days, almost like 125 tablets, and each one costs used to cost 108 rupees. Now I think it has come down to 80 rupees. So it will cost you around 8 to 10,000 rupees. So I am not very sure that a lot of adult people prescribe favipiravir in OPD treatment just because it's available.
And what about remdesivir?
Correct. So remdesivir has been a sort of game changer according to a lot of adult physicians. So remdesivir again was treated as an anti-Ebola drug. So the drug was already existing, but it failed that time actually against Ebola. So the drug had gone into oblivion. But when it was used in SARS and MERS in animal model, it was found to be effective. So someone said, why not use remdesivir in patient with COVID, especially where you have nothing else to work. So that's the reason why it was approved in Japan first for COVID patient, and subsequently emergency use authorization was done in USA, and that paved pathway for a huge trial with remdesivir. So except for one trial done in Hubei in China, where they found that whether you gave remdesivir or you didn't give, there was absolutely no improvement in the clinical outcome. There have been studies with remdesivir initially on a compassionate ground in 57 hospitalized patients, where they found that the drug worked. Then they studied it in, so it showed 68% improvement in oxygen support, 57% against ventilation, and they could be extubated. 50% could be discharged, and the mortality was 13% overall, as compared to we know 20, 25, 30, 40% in otherwise non-treated patients. So that opened the pathway for what are known as recovery trial 1 and recovery trial 2. Recovery trial 1 was in very severe hospitalized patients, so they couldn't do a controlled placebo arm. They just gave remdesivir for 5 days or 10 days, and they found that a lot of them recovered, like in fact 75% recovered significantly, and mortality was 7%. Now, if you compare this with the standard of care alone in similar group of subjects, not treated with remdesivir, but not in the same trial, in some other trial in the same country, the recovery was in 60%, without remdesivir as compared to 75% with remdesivir, and the mortality was 12.5% without remdesivir and 7% with remdesivir, both of them being statistically significant. So probably it did seem to help in patients who are very severe. The recovery trial 2 was in moderate pneumonia. So there they could give remdesivir or only standard care alone. And they found that if you give remdesivir 5 days, then on a score of 7-point score, remdesivir did decrease it did improve the clinical outcome to the tune of 35 to 40%. Now, both these trials are extended. Like the severe patients trial is 5,600 patient. Now, what is known as simple one trial, and the moderate patient recovery trial 2 is extended to 1,000 more subjects. What is known as simple two trial. Now, this trial data is yet to come out, but meantime, there's one more trial, which is a double-blind randomized control trial done in 1,000 patients in United States of America by the NIAID, and they found that in those who were given remdesivir, the time to recovery was 11 days versus placebo, which was 15 days, and mortality was 0.7, that means 30% less. It was not statistically significant during that time, but nonetheless, point estimates wise, there was some benefit. So, and there was no serious side effect. All this makes remdesivir probably a good choice to give before you deteriorate and have immunological cytokine storm. You remember when you develop cytokine storm, virus is not the cause. Virus might have disappeared or maybe even dead. That time you may give remdesivir, but it's not going to help. So remdesivir really is in hospitalized patient before they become very serious or very severe. So someone who has fever, cough, cold, saturation 95%, CT shows some pneumonia, they don't have too much of cytokine storm. You give them remdesivir with methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. Probably many of them will not land up into ICU, or many of them will not land up into trouble. So remdesivir surely is beneficial in hospitalized patient. Only problem is IV, so you have to hospitalize the patient. By the way, you should know remdesivir is also licensed for use in neonates onwards, even in our country for COVID-19.
Okay. So it should be given for 5 days, 10 days.
So they did in recovery 1 and recovery both. They have 5 days and 10 days. They found that 10 days had no benefit over 5 days. So 5 days is the treatment of choice.
Now coming to steroids,
Yes.
what is the role of steroids and which steroid, dexa or methylprednisolone?
Correct. So both are there. I mean, before the dexamethasone, there was a trial done by methylprednisolone in Michigan. They did a quasi-expert study group, as they call, multicentric, for moderate pneumonias needing oxygen or severe pneumonia needing ventilation. So these two group of people, what they did was, first week they just gave standard of care, and then second week they started giving steroid early. So there was two groups, one which were given early steroid, one which were not given early steroid, and they compared the outcome, and they found distinctly that no matter which parameter you look at mortality, you look at respiratory failure, you needed ventilation, or you need look at escalation to an ICU setting, all three of them were reduced by almost 50%. So that was a real game changer to say that methylprednisolone works. Mind you, they don't use very high dose. They use 1 mg per kg twice a day. Then came the recovery trial, where I showed you that the HCQ was dumped as an arm, but the dexamethasone arm of the COVID-19 recovery trial, what they did was they gave dexa, again they gave low dose, 6 mg per kg for up to 10 days or till the time patient improved or discharged. So there are 2,000 subjects on dexa plus standard care. There are 4,000 subjects only on standard care, and they almost 76% of them were either on oxygen or on ventilation, and there were 25% who were neither given oxygen nor ventilated. So they looked at the primary endpoint, which was the all-cause mortality at day 28. They also looked at ventilation need, death, time to discharge, etc. And they found that those who were ventilated, the mortality was reduced by 35%. Those who are on oxygen, the mortality reduced by 20%, whereas those who did not need any respiratory support, the mortality benefit was not there with DEXA. So DEXA is not useful in mild cases or not required. Whereas for moderate and more severe cases, definitely it reduces the mortality. It also reduced the need for ventilation by almost 10 to 15%, or up to 25% in some subjects. So both methylprednisolone and DEXA have actually shown that they are very useful when given early before the patient deteriorated too much.
Right.
And that is
And
obviously because, you know, the patient becomes sick is because of the immunological response. So while you give remdesivir beyond 10 to 12 days, remdesivir has less benefit, steroids have more benefit.
and tocilizumab.
Now that is a bone of contention for, I mean,
Because many pharmaceutical companies have made
yes.
fortunes.
So till day before yesterday, I was jumping in my seat that okay, you have a drug which is approved since last many months, and it has shown beautiful results for those who have cytokine storm and do not respond to remdesivir and steroids alone, and they are progressively becoming more sick. You need to douse the fire by reducing IL-6, knock the IL-6 off, and you give tocilizumab. But yesterday, the first and the greatest phase 3 double-blind randomized controlled trial, what is known as POVECTA, the results have been published by Roche, and look at the company's frankness. Though the trial shows that there is absolutely no benefit of tocilizumab in hospitalized adult patients, they actually showed the results even before they are published. So I will first tell you the results which were in favor, then I'll tell you about the POVECTA. So there is a beautiful paper which actually looks at 4 or 5 different trials on tocilizumab in COVID-19. First few was in China, which were retrospective in few subjects, 20 patients, 15 patients, showed some mortality benefit. The large one trial was actually in Spain and Italy, where they had more than 100 to 200 patients, and they all of them showed that probably less patients go on ventilation and 20% less deaths if you have given tocilizumab in time. Now remember, there is a window before when you have to give tocilizumab. If you give it too late, it's of no use. If you give it too early, it's not required, and it can only induce some infection. So that's a window where suddenly your IL-6 is going up, fever is restarted, your CRP has gone up, and you are becoming more breathless. Is the time. If your steroids have not helped you, you add tocilizumab. But the POVECTA trial, which interim results have been published yesterday, actually it had standard of care plus placebo versus standard of care plus tocilizumab. So it was standard of care in everyone, one group given placebo, one group given tocilizumab. The endpoint was improved score in severity. They did not find any decrease with tocilizumab. The second endpoint was reduced mortality. They did not find any decrease in the mortality. There was some decrease in the median time to discharge and in ventilation-free days, but because the primary endpoint was not met with, the company concluded that Covecta has not shown benefit. But mind you, this was only standard of care and tocilizumab. If you give steroids plus tocilizumab, or if you give remdesivir plus steroid plus tocilizumab, there may be an added benefit of tocilizumab. And those type of trials with tocilizumab and remdesivir, what is known as Remecta, is on. And I'm sure we should wait for this type of trial before we dump tocilizumab as a drug to be used in COVID. Because I'm sure if you ask the intensivists working in COVID area, the adult intensivists and the adult infectious disease specialists, they vouched for it that after remdesivir, steroid, and tocilizumab, the mortality and the days in hospital have drastically reduced in most of the tertiary care hospitals. So I would believe, of course, that's not published data, but I would believe that and not give up on these drugs just blindly.
Yeah. And what about its cousin, itolizumab?
Okay, so when tocilizumab was on hot K, it was not easily available. So itolizumab, which is already anti-CD6 molecule, which also reduces IL-6, interferon gamma, and TNF alpha, was obviously the next molecule that was to be used. The company which makes it did a study, very quick study of 30 patients only, and that is my worry. You know, a study with 30 patients is something which
Small
you
number.
don't want, very small number. And based on this, DCG has given them the permission for limited use. So they had 15 patients on placebo and 15 patients on itolizumab. They were given 1.6 milligram per kg over 6 hours, a single dose repeated after 7 days if required. And cost was 30,000. And when they found that primary endpoint was 30 days mortality, they found that zero was the mortality in tocilizumab group versus 3 died in the placebo group. Now, in 30 patients, this can go either way. Of course, their p-values were very significant. So they are now doing a larger study with enrolling more people in a phase 2, phase 3 combined trial. Following this, there was another group of 16 patients treated in Bombay in one of the hospitals by one physician, and he vouches that the patient improved. We have no doubt to say that it will not improve, but I want to wait for a bigger trial, because see, tocilizumab, same thing happened. Everyone started using it till Covecta came, which was a double-blind randomized control trial in a large group, and it found that it was not useful. Same thing may happen with itolizumab. We don't know, so you may use it now, but with a pinch of salt.
Right. Whenever we hear about a serious patient on ventilator,
Yes.
they say that everything has been given, including plasma.
Correct.
So, what's your take about plasma
Again,
therapy?
plasma has ready-made antibodies. So you take the donors which are recovered, donor which was severe, they will probably be having more titers, and you test them for the antibody, they have to have neutralizing antibody. Then those plasma which are ABO compatible are given to the patient. So it is going to help by giving those ready-made antibodies, like how you give IVIG in sepsis. So those antibodies will neutralize the virus supposedly in the patient. So it is going to be useful in when the patient is in viremia or having virus in the body, right? Which is the first 10 days. After 10 days, as I said, the virus takes a back end, and what takes over is the immunological response.
Cytokines.
Giving plasma, so giving plasma in a terminally ill patient is not going to work. So like remdesivir, plasma therapy should be given early in the infection to prevent patient going into severe infection. So if you want to really give plasma therapy, it should be in the first 10 or 12 days, maximum to 14. After that, you are pushed to the wall, so you're giving, but you see results. Many of them, they don't recover. In fact, there was a trial which was done in the Netherlands. They began the trial with plasma therapy, and they had to abandon it after some time because they found that patients were enrolled from 14 days onwards, and when they checked the antibody in these recipients, patients, they were only antibody positive and having the same titer as the plasma. So how is the plasma going to help? And actually, that's what happened. Those who had received plasma, there was no statistically significant improvement. So plasma has to be selected in patients, probably immune compromised who are not going to mount, probably people with comorbidity who are not going to mount good response, who are antibody negative. You have a plasma from a donor. First 2 weeks, give it with remdesivir. It may help you.
Okay. Now,
That's my take.
cytosol.
That's my take.
Okay. Now, I would request respected senior friends and dear colleagues, getting lot of questions around 217. I think we'll take it at the end of the session because so many
Sure.
questions by now they would have been answered.
Correct.
So, cytosol filters, something about its role, because it was
Correct.
used all over the world in 80,000 patients, but suddenly the interest is there in cytosol filters in the treatment of COVID-19.
Correct. So for patients where you're given remdesivir, you're given steroids, you're given tocilizumab, you repeated tocilizumab, patient is progressively deteriorating. You do his immune markers, they are all haywire, CRP is sky high, IL-6 is not falling. Is a time when you want to trap these cytokines. So you can use cytokine hemofiltration or a cytokine filter. These are very experimental still. There are lots of them available. I'm sure in some people in India, they have been used with or without good benefit. But to me, actually, such patient may be better help with ECMO because of bad lung and heart rather than cytokine filtration alone. So cytokine filtration is one additional therapy after you have tried everything in a very sick patient.
It is available in India, Nitin bhai?
It's available in India.
And how much it costs?
I have no idea because I don't remember at least any of my adult colleagues having used it. But I'm sure Dr. C.P. Bansal had put in one of our past presidents group there, one of his patient friend was actually this cytokine filtration was used.
Okay. Now, so many other medicines they are in use. Like
Like
today only all over India we got a message that one of our colleagues was treated in Surat with injectable methylene blue.
so methylene blue is supposed to be actually not a panacea. There have been trials of using methylene blue in making the plasma viral free and then giving that plasma. So methylene blue inactivates virus. So again, these are all like last ditch efforts where you have tried everything. It's a harmless drug. You can try it, no issue.
Azithromycin.
Azithromycin,
So many of our colleagues already have had
all right.
azithromycin.
So let me make it very clear. Doxycycline, ivermectin, azithromycin, HCQ are all drugs which are given up world over. No one should use them. They are just placebo. If you give azithromycin, you only add to the antimicrobial resistance and you do really no good to the patient.
Right. And the role of or alternate things, vitamin C, vitamin D, like Rujuta Divekar has said that immuno boosters are new weight loss. Everywhere immunity.
Ask her; she's the best judge. I think I know of a story where a child was not putting on weight. He went to the Vaid. Vaid said that you take this faki, one the pudi of medicine, and you have to take it 3 times a day with a glass of milk, which sugar and badam. And he started taking it. The child felt put on weight. It was not because of the faki or the Vaids of medicine, but because of milk and the badam. No? The same thing. These drugs, these things. I mean, I don't know take name, but a lot of innovative medicines are there in place. People vouch for it, but none of them are actually stood the what do you call test of any trial. So if they're harmless like vitamin C and all, you take it, no harm at all. But take in moderation. Don't keep on taking it.
I think somebody should study because government is promoting Ayurvedic ukaras everywhere at all government hospitals. They are being provided, and maximum number of patients they have had it.
Okay, let me be very frank here, Dr. Ramesh. Since last several years, morning, evening, I always take a herbal tea prepared by my wife. I have never asked her what all she put, but I'm sure she put some ajwan, little cinnamon, little elaichi, drop of lemon, some little half spoon of honey, and something else, and the green tea leaves and all, which is harmless. And I drink it because I like it, not because it's COVID. Even after COVID, I will continue to drink. In fact,
Yes,
something I was drinking
absolutely.
now while answering was that because it soothes my throat. So if you're taking from that point of view, fine. But if you think that's a panacea for COVID and that's why you can lower your mask to your chin, is completely wrong.
So now coming to the mask preventive measures. I mean,
Okay.
so many masks. Even now, if you order online dress for your wife, then it will come with a mask of matching color.
All right. So I only one message. Number one, you have to wear appropriate mask. Appropriate mask for a healthcare worker to me is N95. Because you never know who will come and cough on you. Though government still says, ICMR still says that you may use a 3-ply in your non-COVID OPD areas, but I would prefer to use N95. There are only 3 NIOSH certified N95 masks: 3M, Magnum, and Venus. Most of the other masks are not NIOSH certified. I would want to use one of them because I'm sure of the quality. There are several which are CE certified. They are like textile industry certification for the quality of mask, but not for the fit and other things. So I would prefer not to use. But there are many upcoming masks which may be equally good. I am sure they can apply to some agency and get it approved so that you have more faith, because there are a lot of fake masks which are coming and being sold in the name of N95. So beware when you take mask. Mask should be fitting well. Okay, you can use one mask for 5 days, but not 5 consecutive days. Use one, 2 days, second, third, fourth, fifth. On 6th day, use the first mask again. Like that on 11th day. Like that, use 5 times. So 5 masks will last you for 25 days. Some believe 4 times, so 20 days. So anywhere from 4 to 5 uses and then discard it, even though it's looking good. I think one mask costs 60 or 80 rupees. Don't tell me you can't afford 80 rupees every day. At least 80 rupees once in 5 days. Come on, how much money you will accumulate and take with you?
It should not be washed.
Right. Second thing, it should not become wet. If it's wet, you have to throw it away. Third thing, don't put perfume and all on that. It becomes wet because people don't like the breath, the smell of the breath. So people try all indigenous items. Don't do all that. Okay.
So it is
Doffing
better
and
to have cardamom.
doffing and donning. You have to wear. Before that, you have to wash your hand, wear it, adjust, and then again wash your hand. Then don't keep on adjusting, because otherwise every time you touch your mask, every time you have to wash your hand. And when you take it out, you take the lower string first and keep it here. Then you take the second string and catch from the string and put it in a paper bag and don't touch it. And then again wash your hand. So I think doffing is more important than donning. Means removing is more important than wearing. Most of the infection happen while removing rather than while wearing. Same is true for PP, same is true for gloves, same is for any other thing that you are using.
What should be our advice to our patients, to general public? Which mask? Simple cloth.
So I always tell them that when they're on the streets or in the house or in the malls or wherever they are, they can use a cloth mask. Though how good it is, we don't know, but it is better than wearing nothing. When they are in medical facility where there may be high chance of an infection patient, they can use a 3-ply mask. You should also give your receptionist 3-ply mask.
Right. Now the other most effective measure, social distancing. You said mask, social distancing.
So I say social distancing is a better word than physical distancing, because we don't want to get away. I mean, physical distancing is better term than social distancing. We don't want to be socially away. I want to interact with everyone, but I should be not physically near 2 meters. Now, it has to do something with what is known as droplet transmission and airborne transmission. Those which are above 5 microgram size particles, they when the patient talks, coughs, sneezes, they come out. They are large particles, so they go up to maximum 1 or 2 meters and they drop on the surface and they finish there. it may remain alive on a plastic or steel for 2 to 3 days, on a cardboard for 1 day. So if you wipe it off after end of your clinic, you are wiping off and making it clean. But now it's believed that the airborne is more than droplet. Airborne less than 5 micron, up to 1 micron, they can remain in suspended air for hours together, up to 24 hours, and they can travel up to 20 meters. In which case, just distancing is not going to help. Wearing mask is going to help, because I wear a mask, you wear a mask, I talk, you talk, we don't transmit it to one another. That's the reason why I'm telling you mask and mask is the only way where droplet as well as airborne transmission are taken care of, besides your surface sanitization and your hand sanitization. These are the simple ways of keeping you away from corona.
Right. This brings to sensitize people about cough etiquette.
Absolutely. So when you cough in your elbow, never on your hand. Then you change your clothes after coming from your clinic and wash them off. Your PPEs are disposable, then dispose them properly. If they are reusable, whatever way, either sterilization by sterilizer or autoclave or soap water or whatever is your instruction, do it properly. And while doing that, don't get infected, and see that you are not in trouble.
And sanitation is very important for all of us. So
Absolutely.
can you elaborate a bit?
So
in
you
detail?
have hypochlorite solution which is sanitizing the surface. Remember, on your colored wall, if you use, then the color tends to become fade. The instant sanitizer are all isopropyl alcohol based. They come as a spray, so your knobs, your stethoscopes, your pens, etc., can be sterilized with that. For your hand, you have to have either isopropyl alcohol or ethanol, minimum 70% and more. Some of them also have other chemicals. It's up to you. So you can use any of them, and those 7 steps, I know, I hope you know. First step is like this, second step is like this, third is only the thumb, fourth is the back of the finger, fifth is the tip of the finger, sixth is the back of the dorsum, and seventh is your cups. This
Okay.
must be followed. Take 30 seconds, whether it is soap or sanitizer, and let the sanitizer evaporate. Then you are fit to examine the next patient.
And so many colleagues they ask that the wearing hand gloves is very
Yes.
inconvenient and quite irritating.
So there is no
How
need.
do
You can use directly hand, provided you sanitize with sanitizer every time between two patients. Some of them develop very dry hands, so then they have to wear a gloves and sanitize with the gloves on. But you have to sanitize. There is no other choice. And isopropyl alcohol is better than ethanol, because ethanol leads to more dryness of the skin than isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol is more expensive.
Right. Now, the COVID-19 has brought all of us to a very peculiar situation where we should be ready for our clinic. Clinic preparedness would be a totally new thing which our
Correct.
generation has not witnessed or rather practiced
Correct.
previously.
Correct.
So, I think this is very important for all of
Yeah.
our colleagues.
So I'll tell you briefly. First of all, try to do video consultation where you're touching the patient not required. When you have to call them, give them by appointment so they don't have crowding. When they come to let not many relatives come, not more than keeping physical distancing in your waiting area and in your clinic. Then your staff has to be prepared. So your clinic has to be sanitized with the surface sanitizer every day, before you enter and after you leave. And if you have very lengthy time, then in between also. Then your ACs. You can use an AC, but remember that one of the windows should be kept open for fresh air to come in and out. Because if you have only closed your AC, your airborne circulation will remain. IIP has formed a task force. Day before yesterday, we had a meeting. By next Monday or Tuesday, we will come out with a solid guideline on preparedness and on the use of AC. If you can put an exhaust fan in your clinic such way that the air goes away from you, it will give you extra protection. If you can't do it because of an interior problem, you have to see that your one of the windows is kept open even when the AC is on, or don't use AC, keep a fan and keep the windows open. All right. And you have to clean your tables, your patient's table, and maintain utmost hygiene of your hand before and after touching the patient. And don't forget your stethoscopes and your pens.
Very important. Nitin bhai, so many people ask us, and so many colleagues also think that when this pandemic is going to end, and what
Look,
would be the final tally of deaths by that time?
probably when the entire world is infected, around 80-85% is the time when the disease will become endemic and few cases will happen. If you believe the 56% seroprevalence in slums area in Mumbai, in 6 months, maybe in 1 year's time, many of us would be infected and that's the end of it. Or if a vaccine comes before, which is very effective and long-lasting immunity, then that's where the end will come. I don't see an end coming, at least for next 1 year.
Oh, that's scary, really scary.
Yeah, let's be prepared than to be scary, I would say.
So now we have come to an end of
Yes.
first session, and now we'll be moving to second part that is very important for all of us, bread and butter of pediatricians, vaccines.
Yes.
So we'll divide it in two parts: vaccine